It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here to our Kafeneion. Um, Dueling elections. The Atlantic is narrower than it looks. We have a fabulous lineup for you this evening. Kafeneion is all about bringing our members together, providing you what we think is a really interesting and wide-ranging program of different speakers talking about all kinds of different topics. If you ever have an idea for us for a Kafeneion, you're welcome to share it with us. Sarah Jane Leone, as I mentioned, is the organizer, and this was also her original idea to begin these Kafeneions during the pandemic as a way for our members to keep in touch when we couldn't meet face to face. And we kept it up after the pandemic has at least no longer kept affecting our daily lives so much, and are happy to be bringing you this one this evening. And as I said, I'm just going to turn it over now to our chair, Brady, because we have a full program in store for you tonight. Please enjoy. And when you have questions, I'll just remind you quickly, write them in the chat. And after both speakers and Brady are finished, I'll be calling on you to ask your question personally, or Brady will do it. We'll figure that out as we go along. All right. Thank you. Brady, our chair.
Okay, thank you, Gina. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this Kafeneion. It's a very important topic. The US elections play a role all over the world, but so do European elections. And when we say dueling elections, we are talking about the fact that the United States and the European Union and the UK exist in a triangle that when they speak to each other, when they understand each other, has historically been enormously effective in keeping the world a not completely horrible place. If they stop talking to each other, we're all in deep trouble. And I'm very happy to start out our program today by introducing Ambassador Michael Roberts. I have a hard time calling him ambassador because we were children together in Athens. He at the British Embassy, I at the US Embassy, partners in crime, trying to figure out Greece, with both of us very idealistic. The British have a much more professional foreign service than we have, I think, but he tolerated me. In any case, Michael has served, he was ambassador to the Slovak Republic. He's been at the British representation in the European Union, the Cabinet Office, which is a very serious place to work. They only take you there if they think you're very effective, very discreet, and very knowledgeable. Since he retired, he's done work building democracy, building capacity in various countries. He was horrified by Brexit and has been working to minimize the damage of Brexit as best he can, in part by canvassing in the current the recent UK elections to punish the Conservatives as much as was possible under the circumstances. And Michael, if you could just tell us a little bit about what the flavor of those elections was, and then take it from there with how you see those elections, Europe, and anything else.
Brady, thank you very much indeed. It's fantastic to be with you on this lovely summer's evening. I'm going to share my screen. Brady, is that okay?
It's certainly fine with me.
So
Gina,
here goes. If it falls apart, I apologize, but with luck, it will work. And see what happens. As Brady says, I was a very happy diplomat in Athens back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I'm one of the few British diplomats to have worked both in Athens and in Ankara, never in Cyprus, which was always my dream, but I then sort of moved over to Eastern Europe. And that's, I guess, the principal focus of my interests at the moment. Can you see my screen, Brady? Does it make sense what you can see, or do I need to adjust it?
No, it looks beautiful. It's very, very iconic.
Okay, right. Well, I'm going to start in Macon, Georgia. Why, you might ask? Well, on the 22nd of May, barely 2 months ago, I happened to be in Macon, and I won't bore you with the reasons why I ended up there, but I was curious to find myself in one of the principal swing states in the US, a state I'd never visited before. And I was interested to see how it felt and how this sort of very balanced, finely balanced political state might show up 6 months or so before your elections. And in fact, I spent quite a lot of time at the Capricorn studios, which some of you may know from Greg Allman and co. Not my scene for music. It was a bit strange for me, but hey, it was a good place to be. And it was the town where I saw my first proper campaign poster, a Biden-Harris poster in the garden of one of those splendid houses you find in Macon, which I snapped. I snapped on the day that back in London, Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, walked out into the pouring rain outside his residence in London to call an early election. No one really understands why he felt the need to do this in such wet conditions. He stood there outside without any kind of protection, umbrella, and basically looked incredibly stupid, incredibly, how can I say, British. We don't mind the weather, say we Brits. And there he was, announcing an early election. He could have held this election up to 8 months later, and January next year was the real deadline, but he decided to call it early. And there's no clear explanation for why he decided to go early. Possibly the most plausible reason is that he could only see things getting worse. So better to call it now before things got absolutely terrible. So an election was called, and 6 weeks later, on the 5th of July, we in Britain found ourselves with a new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer, I should call him, leader of the Labour Party. And here is a picture taken actually only a week ago in Paris at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, where Keir Starmer shows himself to be totally impervious to rain, while all about him, including, I suspect, the Greek Prime Minister sitting on his left, are covered in ponchos and lots of rain, and not looking terribly happy. But Keir Starmer has now been our Prime Minister for 3 weeks and is, well, doing a pretty good job. More on him in just a moment. But going back, it's worth remembering that in Britain, we haven't had a complete change of government now for 14 years. It was back in 2010 that David Cameron took power, actually at the head of a coalition government. And he took it from the Labour Party, where we'd had two hugely successful prime ministers, Tony Blair, probably the best prime minister we've had, certainly in my lifetime, followed by Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown lost that election narrowly. Cameron took over for 6 years and regrettably, stupidly, unforgivably called an election, called a referendum on whether the UK should remain in the European Union. And this prime minister, this Etonian, Oxfordian educated conservative prime minister who thought he could walk on water, lost that referendum, and which led, of course, to our leaving the European Union in 2021, effectively. Theresa May took over from him for 3 pretty hapless years. She really didn't know what the European Union was, and negotiating our exit from it was a disaster. Boris Johnson took over from her in a bid to well, he really wanted to take credit for the fact that the referendum had gone his way, that is, in favor of leaving the European Union. But Boris Johnson's only aim in life was to promote himself. And we ended up with 3 years, not only of his really botching our exit from the EU, but also botching the management of the COVID pandemic. He was forced out in 2022 when the corruption surrounding his government was so obvious, so evident, so appalling that people felt that he had to go. He resigned, and without any kind of an election, Liz Truss took over. Liz Truss was a so-called rising star of the Conservative Party. There had been no general election, but the membership thought that she would be the best place to take over the reins of power. She lasted just 49 days. She crashed the economy in those 49 days, and we're all paying the economic price for that. She was succeeded by Rishi Sunak, I suppose notable because of his Asian heritage, and we might come on to that point a little later. He had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, our finance minister, and seemed very competent, but really he lacked any political flair. And he too was someone who'd become prime minister without any kind of general election. He was there because the Conservatives thought he would make the best guy for the job. And his lack of political flair became increasingly evident. So we've had 5 Conservative prime ministers, none of whom have distinguished themselves. We had Brexit, of course, and it's worthwhile remembering that the Brexit slogan, take back control, and specifically take back control of our borders to keep out migrants, take back control of our money to stop spending money on the European Union, and to take back control of our laws to make sure that no foreign court could tell us what to do. This slogan, of course, has a link to MAGA, Make America Great Again. It's that backward-looking view. We used to be great and we'd like to be great again, which seems to be a common refrain of all those on the right of our politics. Perhaps I should say the far right, but I'm afraid in the UK, it's just the right. Take back control, harking back to times when things were better and Britain was, shall we say, Great Britain. Liz Truss is still a deluded lady. She was at the Republican National Convention the other day, meeting no one so far as we could see. Her 49 days in office were compared to a lettuce leaf, which seemed to have a slightly longer lifespan than she did as Prime Minister. And that is roughly what she's remembered for now. But sadly, she hasn't gone away, despite losing her seat. In other words, not having any kind of political base at all. She's trying to pull the remains of her party further to the right. And then there was Rishi Sunak, who fought his 6-week campaign valiantly, but really rather stupidly. I mean, possibly his biggest mistake in the campaign was to leave the commemorations for D-Day in Normandy rather too early, which resulted in this picture that caused amazement back in Britain. David Cameron, yes, a former prime minister and someone with a certain dignity, but nevertheless, where was our prime minister alongside Macron, Scholz, and Biden? Well, he'd gone home early because he said he had to campaign. In fact, he just wanted to give a bog standard interview to a TV crew. This looked really bad, and my goodness, he was made to suffer for that lack of good judgment. His main rival, Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, had a much better campaign. There were some things that went mildly wrong. Keir Starmer had a tick. He made a thing of the fact that his father had been a toolmaker to underline his origins as working class, which I think is probably very fair. He was from what we call a working class family. But he made this point so many times that people started making memes about it. And this one that actually came from from a recent football match where England lost, shows an apparent argument between the heir to our throne and the new prime minister. But by and large, Keir Starmer had a good campaign. And this was his slogan, change. It was remarkably effective. Just one word, and it really seemed to sum up what British people wanted when they voted at the start of this month. Change, above all, they wanted competence. They wanted people who were simply competent to run a government without screwing up so massively, didn't line their own pockets, didn't crash the economy, didn't mess around with our neighbors and friends in Europe and across the Atlantic. We just wanted someone who would relieve us from this shame, this humiliation of being governed by people who weren't up to the job. I'll come on to policies a little later, foreign policy in particular, but it's notable that Keir Starmer did say quite consistently that he was not in the business of seeking to rejoin the European Union or indeed to rejoin the customs union or the single market of the European Union, much to the disappointment of many of his supporters. But of course, people like me, who would have loved to see us rejoining at least one of those three things, had nowhere else to go. So we had to vote for Keir Starmer. The elections were held on your Independence Day, American Independence Day at least. This is a map of the results. On the left, you can see how the 650 constituencies that make up the UK's House of Commons, our elected body from which the Prime Minister is drawn. Back in 2019, most of those seats were blue. And in our system, blue is Conservative, the centre-right. This month, there's a much more variegated colour. You can see a lot of red and quite a lot of orange. Red is for the Labour Party, our centre-left party. Orange is for the Liberal Democrats, our centrist party. And you can see a very few splashes of green and grey for the Reform Party, on which more in a moment. Up in Scotland to the north, you can see that the Scottish nationalists are actually much reduced. And I guess the most important thing to draw from this, apart from the fact that Labour have made inroads into previously very staunch Conservative areas, is that Labour's control over the big cities, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, is complete. The Conservative Party are nowhere to be seen in the big cities. Here are the detailed results, and it's worth looking at one or two facts here. We have 650 seats in our House of Commons. So a majority means what? 326 to be precise. And Labour won 411, a massive majority. But look across that top line, and you'll see that Labour won that majority, 63% of all the seats, on the basis of just 34% of the votes. So there never has been any pretense in our system that we have a proportional system. The winner really takes just about everything. And that's the way it's been set up. There are advantages to this system, which we call first past the post, and you're familiar with it from the States. But really, it excelled itself this month. We've never had such a disproportional outcome. The Conservatives won 24% of the vote and got 19% of the seats. Not too bad. The Liberal Democrats, who usually lose out massively, got 72 seats, which is 11% of the seats and 12% of the vote. So they were pretty happy for the first time ever. But one party in particular did badly, and I'd ask you to look at the Reform Party, which is our far-right party, led by Nigel Farage, won just 5% of the seats, 5 seats, so less than 1% of the seats, on the basis of over 14% of the votes. over 4 million people voted for the far right, and they were rewarded with just 5 seats. That is deliberate. That is how our system is set up, but inevitably it has triggered a huge debate on whether or not we shouldn't reform our electoral system to allow a more proportional system. The debate has always been there, but the status quo has been the preference of the two major parties, and I suspect will continue to be, although that is probably not the best long-term, the wisest, can I say, long-term outcome. The Greens did pretty well, nearly 2 million votes, 6.7% of the vote, but got just 4 seats. And one or two others to note. The Scottish National Party, SNP, lost 39 seats. They're now just left with 9 seats. And that is a massive blow to the party that's trying to make Scotland independent of the UK. Remember that Scotland voted against Brexit. So very reluctantly was it drawn into leaving the EU, which boosted the Scottish National Party. But in recent months, it suffered scandals, and Labour has clawed back a lot of the support that it used to own, but has, in the last 15, 20 years, has ceded to the Scottish Nationalists. The other group to note is, it's very hard to decipher from this chart, but in Northern Ireland, the Unionists, that's the Protestant Unionists, the DUP, have lost grounds, lost 3 seats, and Sinn Féin, the nationalist group, have held their position, which is indicative of the fact that nationalists are now a majority in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. Sinn Féin are the majority, or the largest party in the north, and are probably the largest party in the Republic of Ireland, which will have elections later this year. And we could see a Sinn Féin-led government in Dublin and a Sinn Féin-led government in Belfast, which raises questions about the future of Northern Ireland. One lovely piece of British political theatre is that Rishi Sunak, the outgoing Prime Minister, left within 12 hours of losing. Now, this is pretty remarkable, particularly after our experience of the 6th of January a few years ago. But Rishi Sunak went out of his number 10 Downing Street residence within 12 hours and said, "I'm sorry. I have failed to deliver. I've heard the verdict of the British people and I'm resigning, and good luck to Keir Starmer." So he left promptly, he left extremely graciously, and has continued to be very gracious in his approach to Keir Starmer. And this is something actually rather remarkable about our system in Britain, and one that you guys in the States might think rather hard about. But the system in Britain changes in an instant. That one government leaves, the other comes in, and everything changes immediately. We have a full cabinet, a government within 24 hours. The removal vans have been and gone. And hey, we turned a new leaf. Back in 2010, when the Labour government left, Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. And I found this picture again, which has reminded me of how we do things. This is actually from Tom Fletcher, Gordon Brown's foreign affairs advisor. Gordon Brown, in the middle of this rather grainy picture, leans over to Tom Fletcher at the top of the picture and says, "So what are you doing?" And this is the day before he resigned. And Tom Fletcher rather sheepishly says, "Well, I'm preparing a brief for David Cameron, your successor, for his call with President Obama." So the transition is very, very fast in Britain, and something that perhaps you could learn from. I thought this table was quite interesting, and you might bear it in mind as you set about campaigning for your elections in November. What were the red lines for British voters earlier this month? The question here is, what policies would rule out your voting for a particular party? And you can see at the top of the list that any political party who proposed criminalizing abortion would lose massively, instantaneous. 2/3 of Brits would vote against that party, which I guess, in the light of Roe versus Wade having been overturned, is pretty significant. Any party that proposed privatizing our glorious National Health Service would be kicked out. Withdrawal from NATO, letting in too many migrants. Yes, of course, I guess that's common. Banning same-sex couples from adopting children. This list is quite interesting. The nuclear deterrent. And bear in mind, Labour Party had a leader in Jeremy Corbyn just 5 years ago who was a bit wishy-washy on the nuclear deterrent. Well, the British electorate didn't like that, and they didn't vote for him. Abolishing the monarchy, right down to legalizing assisted dying and so on. So some quite interesting pointers as to what a 35 million strong electorate will stand for and what they won't. So if you're thinking of campaign platforms, you might refer to this list. I spoke a moment ago about the lack of proportionality in our electoral outcomes. At the bottom of this chart, you can see the red line moving from 34% to 63%. That is the Labour government's 34% share of the vote and their 63% share of the seats. That is the most striking example of disproportionality that our system has thrown up, though by no means the only one. In campaigning, I would say a very important lesson for me is that all politics are local. I was absolutely gobsmacked to find that the biggest issue that in one particular area of the Salisbury constituency where I was campaigning was the location of 2 EV charging points. Should they be beside an old pub, or was there no need for them? Do remember when you're campaigning how important local issues are. It's easy to forget, particularly when you're coming from abroad and you look at things with geostrategic importance, not when you're campaigning on the ground. And equally, I was very struck by the fact that Labour were encroaching on territory that had never before seen a Labour candidate, never contemplated Labour winning in their area. And 1 or 2 voters came out to me after I'd knocked on their doors and said, "Thank you so much for coming around here, but please can you tell me, where do I go to vote?" And I'm ashamed to say I couldn't tell them where to go to vote. It was one of those local things that simply hadn't occurred to me. But these are people who probably had effectively been disenfranchised for most of their lives. So think about that local vote. And I will stop there. So a little bit of the flavour of the new reality in Britain. We have a Labour government with a massive majority carving a new platform for itself on the international stage. But over to you, Evan.
Michael, that was wonderful. Clearly, we could listen to you for another couple of hours, and we will, during the questions, I'm sure many things will come up. But first, let's give the floor to Evan, who can put the UK elections in the broader context of Europe, because various fascinating things have happened, like European parliamentary elections, which produced very complicated results, which Evan can talk about. But anyway, he's, as former Prime Minister Tsipras's diplomatic advisor, Evan has been part of discussions all over the planet, literally, I would say, on the role of Greece, the role of Europe, the role of the leftist parties And whether the Democrats are a leftist party, most people would say we're not. The Republicans would say we are. So, at any rate, Evan, tell us tell us what's going on, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Brady, and thank you very much to all of you for the invitation, and to Michael for his opening this discussion with a very interesting presentation. I'm very eager to get into that discussion, and maybe in the end of our discussion we can open up that can of worms that you just did, Brady, about the left and the Democrats and their relationships to the left in the West. I think it's an interesting question. I'd like to just touching upon a few of the themes that were just brought up, go into a broader discussion, a broader picture about what's going on in Europe. And I think that would inform some of the discussions that are going on in the US and the West in relation to the upcoming elections in the United States. I think there are 4 or 5 big points that we can make about where Europe is going and has gone in the last 10, 15 years, and I'd like to discuss them, particularly using the example of the last European elections. Now, I've sent to Brady some charts, and maybe they could be passed around by email afterwards, that are or now or later, that kind of show what the trend is in the European Parliament in terms of seats. This is a chart that shows the seats now in today's European Parliament after the elections, and there's another chart that shows the distribution of seats between the European families. This is it since the first European elections. And if we can just stay there for a bit, I'd like to refer to this. What the most important for me trend is the strengthening of the extreme right, both in relation to the mainstream conservative and right-wing parties in Europe, but in relation to all political systems in Europe as a whole. So first of all, you have a strengthening of the extreme right in terms of absolute numbers. And if you can see in the very right of this chart, on the very bottom, if we look at the numbers for national conservatives, the radical right, and a lot of the non-attached are also connected to the what we would call the extreme right, we see that percentage growing as years go by and being on its highest levels now. So one is the absolute numbers. The other is the actual role in terms of national governments that the extreme right has. So we have governments where the balance between the right and the extreme right is either in favor of the hard right. We see that, for example, in Italy, in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, or there is a right-wing government that depends on the support of the hard or extreme right, like in Sweden. So that's the second way in which the strength of the extreme right is becoming more and more obvious as years go by, and particularly in the current period. The third area, the third proof of this big change is the role that the hard right or extreme right, I'd say, has in the opposition as an opposition force. We see that in France. I think that's the strongest example of Le Pen. We see it in Germany with AfD. We saw it in the current European elections in Greece. We see it in Austria. We see it in several countries where the extreme right is becoming stronger and stronger. At the same time, we see that the discourse, and this is another area where the strength of the extreme right is clear, is that extreme right discourse is entering the mainstream. It's entering the mainstream in a very dominant way, not only in terms of mainstream discourse. I give the example of Austria. We can discuss Greece up to a certain extent too, or France. And some of the Macron policies, particularly on migration, that have been affected by it. But we can see it also on the left in Slovakia, Denmark. So these are all examples of how the balance between the extreme right and the right, and the role of the extreme right in the European national political systems and the European system as a whole is strengthened. And in our discussion, we can get a bit more into the sociological reason for why that has happened in the last decades. I think the second important characteristic of what we see as time goes by is that the center left or social democratic parties in Europe remain strong, but are clearly weaker than in the past. And you can look back at this table and see that the strongest period was in the 90s for social democratic parties, and certainly in many countries after the war also. But in the last period that we are looking at, it's in the 90s, and the weakening has been gradual, particularly after the third way movement of Tony Blair, supported also by Clinton, of Gerhard Schroeder, Lionel Jospin. So in the last 20 years, we see a gradual weakening of this role of social democratic parties in Europe. The UK is an exception, and I think also the UK is also connected to a very specific phenomenon that has to do with Britain that Michael referred to, which is the fact that we've had conservative governments and weak conservative governments in many cases, if not catastrophic, for the last 14 years. So it's a similar trend that we see in countries where there have been conservative governments for a long time. But it is an exception. Spain also has a strong social democratic government, but we don't see a resurgence as such in the next period. We see strength, but not dominance, and a weaker position than in the past. And in the last European parliamentary elections, we saw that clearly. We see it we see some strong social democratic parties in the opposition, for example, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Portugal. We see them remaining gaining back their position of strength from the left, but not fully. We see that in France or in Greece. We see that in Finland up to a certain extent, but still in Finland we see the left being stronger, the more radical left being stronger than the social democratic parties. In any case, we see a strong social democratic political family, but definitely not a dominant one, and in some cases, as we've seen Germany, a weaker and weaker position. I think there's a third trend that we need to look at, and I think it's one that we can refer to in our discussion also, our discussion on the United States. This has to do with a phenomenon called spectral politics. The idea that there are more and more parties in our time that are taking a leaf out of policies and rhetoric from across the political spectrum. So there are political parties in Italy, in Greece, in Germany, and more on the left, and on the center, but also on the right, in Hungary, in Italy, in France, that will take policies from anywhere from the extreme left to the extreme right in their own rhetoric. I think that's and their policies. I think that's an interesting phenomenon that we should look at. I think a lot of the times on the left, this is connected to opposition parties that are trying to regain part of the agenda from the right. And in terms of hard right or extreme right parties, these are parties like Orban in Hungary that are using in their cultural politics positions from the extreme right, but are trying to take some of the economic policies that have been traditionally connected to the left, a lot of times successfully. So I think that's the third phenomenon that is important in Europe and that we should keep when looking at how developments are going. Finally, I think we should think about the broader global framework in which all these changes have been taking place in the last years. The strength of the center left and the strength in particular that was connected to the Clinton years, and by connection to that in Europe, the third way politics that Michael referred to before with Tony Blair and Gerhard Schroeder, PASOK here in Greece, but also in France and other countries in Scandinavia, were connected to a very specific post-Cold War framework. I'm not discussing the decades before because there's a big story to tell about post-war political system in Europe. But since 1990, and for at least 30 years, 25 years, the possibility of progress that center-left and left parties have supported was inscribed in a broader liberal international order that had a level of predictability. And it was inscribed on a broader framework of the economic neoliberal, characterized by some, globalization. So that was based on the dominance of the United States. This dominance, I think, on an economic and a political level, started shaking in a very, very clear way. It started being disputed by Putin in 2007 with his Munich speech, by the elections in China with President Xi. I'm sorry, I used the word elections. That was wrong. By the developments in China and the designation of President Xi in 2012, opening up the whole South China Sea discussion, by Iran in 2005 developing its nuclear program. That is the broader geopolitical context in which also we see the American weakness, if not defeat, in different parts of the globe, including Afghanistan, Iraq, and also Libya. And in parallel to this geopolitical reality, we had the Lehman Brothers crisis in 2008, the shaking of the whole economic system, the big economic crisis that hurt the Eurozone also. And all this ushered in a new period that we are still going through today. And I believe the war in Ukraine is a turning point in relation to this period, because in the last 15 years, what we see is a period of multiple parallel crises, a big economic crisis, a big refugee crisis, the biggest since the Second World War, the pandemic crisis, an energy crisis tied to a price crisis that has been sorely felt in many parts of Europe, and then a broader climate crisis on top of all these developments. So in a period of multiple crises, I think, and a period of strong antagonism, strong global antagonism, and the shaking of the liberal international order, the framework of the center left, this framework for progressive politics, if we can use this word broadly to cover, as you said, Brady, everything from the Democrats to the more stronger, to the more harder left-wing parties in Europe. The framework for progressive politics, peculiarly enough, it's weakened. It is not strengthened. And I'd be very happy to discuss why this is so. But it's weakened because the space for predictability is not there, so the space for promising progress is not there. And the space for having a center left or a left that could promise better days and that can put forward a positive vision is less and less. So what we're left with is a politics that says, vote for us so that Trump doesn't come back, or a politics that says, vote for us for change. But we don't have enough of an agenda, of a progressive agenda that could unite the Western left in a way that the third way politics of the late 90s did, even with its different nuances of a more radical left and a more center left. And I think there what's left is a kind of politics, a cultural and an economic politics that is a space that is more advantageous for conservative parties, and particularly the extreme right, because when you have such a shift in the global international order as we are having and we are seeing today, such antagonisms, the question of fear is much more central than it was 20 years ago. The idea of protecting your identity is much more central. So the messages about taking back control or being great again have much greater resonance. There is research that shows, and I can send everyone the article, and this is research is focused in the United States, that there is a space of society that recognizes the advantages of Biden policies in terms of their lives. Can you hear me? Hello?
Lost communication.
We can hear you.
Yes, okay, that's good. So people
Yes, can hear you.
Yes, citizens recognize the advantages of Biden policies to their daily lives, but their need to relate to the politicians on that they vote for, a lot of times is greater than the actual material benefit that these policies have to their daily life. So identity is more important than before, and identifying with candidates. So I think there we need to be thinking not only in terms of what kind of progressive agenda would change the realities on the first 2 points that I described. So shift the balance in terms of the role that the extreme right has in mainstream politics, strengthen center left and left-wing parties. We should be thinking of a broader progressive agenda that could help in this direction. But we should also be thinking of the broader global geopolitical picture. And I would like to close by recommending a very interesting article that was written in Foreign Affairs last month by Ben Rhodes, who, as you know, was in the Obama cabinet in a very central role in the Obama cabinet. So Ben Rhodes' article is called "A Foreign Policy for the World as It Is, Biden and the Search for a New American Strategy." Obviously, this was before Biden stepped down as a candidate for the election. And there he highlights that a lot of what we call the need for a progressive agenda has to also be connected to a foreign policy coming from the United States and the EU on the basis of a new transatlantic dialogue, where the US exerts leadership but not primacy. I think that's a very interesting concept, because he goes on to recognize that we live in a new polar world, and the multilateral institutions that we need to promote peace, social justice, to fight climate crisis, to get the best out of artificial intelligence and avoid all the challenges, is a new international order that is based on US leadership, but not US primacy. And it's based on a different kind of leadership from the US and the West in terms of multilateral coalitions. And that would create also the space for a more progressive politics on a national level. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to discuss further. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Evan. Very good analysis of the big picture. Now, I cannot resist having us bore in a little bit. As a former diplomat, as a diplomat, my job was to represent whatever the government was of the day. And most of the time for me, that was very easy. Only with the Bush George W. Bush government and the decision to invade Iraq did it become impossible for me as a diplomat to act. But I'm fascinated. I'd love to hear you, Michael, and you, Evan, describe for our audience, which hasn't lived diplomacy up close and personal, how does each new government affect your work? And to be indiscreet, if you can be, did the American diplomats that you encountered seem traumatized or empowered by, for example, Donald Trump as president or any other president? Could you give us just an example of how this works in your own life? Michael?
Well, I think that Europe in general, but diplomats particularly on this side of the Atlantic, have had to behave with very tight composure in the face of the Trump presidency that we had until 3 years ago, and have found it very hard to contain not just their sort of desire that the Democrats should win this coming November, but also their immense fear of what another Trump presidency would mean. And you can see that wherever you look, particularly here in Brussels, people have been putting together strategies to cope with another Trump presidency. And these are essentially defensive strategies. How are we going to rescue Ukraine? What are we going to do about an almost inevitable trade war? Is NATO going to survive another Trump presidency? And people talk about this pretty openly here. I mean, you have to. In an EU of 27, you can't avoid public discussion, and diplomats are at the eye of that discussion. I think there's unadulterated terror at the thought that Trump might reassume his position in the White House, and a recognition that Europe has to stand up to this. In Britain, it's slightly more subtle, but not very much more. I was struck by the absence of a debate about the US in our elections. It didn't come up explicitly. I would say it was on the minds of many voters. We've got to make sure we have a sensible government, because what will we do if Trump becomes president again? There is a lot of maneuvering going on in British politics around Trump. We've discovered one use for Boris Johnson. The retired, useless Prime Minister Boris Johnson does serve a purpose by virtue of the fact that he's one of the few people who can talk to Trump and actually try and persuade to continue to help Ukraine. Now, that is a service that we're all pretty grateful for. Nigel Farage, the leader of our far-right party, is trying to acquire a similar position, but he too was at the Republican National Convention but failed to get a meeting with Trump. He wants to be British ambassador in Washington. I don't think you'll get that job, but you can see a lot of maneuvering going on in the face of a possible Trump presidency. And I would further say there is an audible sigh of relief that with Harris now leading the Democrat charge, there is a sense that, my goodness, we might not actually have to face this crisis. Might not. No complacency, not yet at any rate, but there is a sense that we've been saved. So it's pretty open. And we really don't want to go there again, because for us in Europe, it's existential. NATO, Ukraine, or Russia, rather, climate, everywhere, and the economy and trade, everywhere we look, a Trump presidency is disastrous, and people really aren't too embarrassed about saying as much.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That is very clear. And I think there are a number of people who enjoyed hearing you say that. I mean, the good enjoyed, but also reminded that they should be terrified too. But so, Evan, what can you tell us?
I agree with what Michael said. My impression also is that there is an effort by there is an effort to there is a worry about what could happen if President Trump is reelected, and in that framework, there is a continuation of policies that President Trump supported in his first term, which in the conditions we are now, which are even worse than 4 years ago because of the war in Ukraine and the even worse situation in the Middle East, would create a lot of dangers and challenges. And that includes, of course, transatlantic dialogue, the role of NATO. But, and I think there is a lot of thinking about how the proposals and the ideas that that Donald Trump is putting forward, how they, if he does become president, could in some way be framed in ways that do not weaken the role of the West in the region, that do not weaken the support to Ukraine. But everybody knows that if there is an election of President Trump, that means that everybody will have to go to the drawing board in the State Department in general. So I've gotten that impression very much. But I have to say, I think American colleagues are careful in discussing, at least with me, in discussing these issues, exactly because one cannot easily predict what will happen. And I think in times like these, what we will need is cooler minds and colleagues that will be able to do some crisis management in difficult moments, and not necessarily colleagues that will take a very partisan stance and then be completely marginalized in a future State Department under President Trump. So I think that there's a lot of colleagues that are wary about this, and I think that is a correct way to go, although I share some of the concern about a possible Trump reelection. If I may add just one more point, I think that if there is a Trump reelection, and if in general there is a strengthening of the extreme right or the far right in Europe, it's not something that we should just take as a development that makes us insist even more on our positions. I think in the progressive side of the spectrum, we need to keep our values, but there are things that we have to learn about mistakes we've made in the past. And there are things we have to learn about the new international order that's ahead of us. Either Trump is elected or he's not. And that we have to be thinking about this. And there are British and American colleagues that have this in mind. And that's why I wanted to point out Ben Rhodes's article that is very reflective about this. He doesn't just say how terrible it will be if President Trump is reelected. He said, the world is changing anyway, whether he is or not. If he is, it's an example of how much we need to rethink how we're working. And that, I think, includes the diplomatic community.
Thank you very much, Evan. Karen, do we have questions in the chat? Okay, we have a question from Daniel on electoral systems. You want to unmute yourself, Daniel?
Certainly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Really, I was wondering, New Zealand uses MMP, so a mixed member proportional system, which is a proportional system. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. Fundamentally, the number of seats you get in Parliament is equal to the percentage of your vote as a percentage of the total vote. And they split the seats between a set of constituency seats and party list seats. I suspect that in the UK, the 13% that Farage got, were that to be 13% of the seats in Parliament, that would pretty much change the whole dynamic of what's going on in the UK. I'm wondering about your thoughts on value or benefit of first past the post versus actual proportional representation, because on the other hand, Greens get almost no seats, but they always get 10 to 15% of the vote.
Shall I go with that, Brady?
Yes, Michael.
There was a glorious moment in Tony Blair's premiership when he seriously, he got into bed with our Liberal Democrats to have a serious discussion about electoral reform, to moving to a proportional system. And they got quite close to doing it. But in the end, the Labour Party tribe got at Blair and said, we don't need to do this. We can go on winning an election, be a single party government forever and ever, which of course wasn't the case. There is an inevitable swing. And in 2010, the Conservatives got in, as I say, for 14 years, and Brexit was the outcome. A ruin of our country was the outcome. And I think there is a strand of feeling in Keir Starmer's Labour Party that they're going to have to look very hard at bringing in some kind of proportional system in order to keep out what is now not just the far right of Nigel Farage, but what is now a very right-wing Conservative Party. A Conservative Party that is, in the short term, irrelevant because it's so weak. But in the longer term, if it gets back into power, it's likely to adopt quite a lot of the policies that Nigel Farage is currently espousing. There's now a leadership election underway for the Conservative Party, and the most moderate of the 6 candidates, Tom Tugendhat, has this week suggested that he could be persuaded to vote in favour of leaving the UK, leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, for a mainstream political party and a mainstream candidate to propose that is incredible. I mean, it's awful, but it's incredible too. And that is the direction that the Conservative Party is being pulled. And I think that the progressives in Britain, Labour Party, Greens, and Liberal Democrats, need to think seriously about entrenching an electoral system that will entrench their own cordon sanitaire to keep out right-wing politics. A lot of things need to happen to get there. The Labour Party needs to accept that it won't have a massive majority once PR is in place, whatever kind of PR it is, but that it will have to act in coalition, which is perfectly capable of doing. But I think two sort of psychological barriers that all political parties, but particularly the Labour Party, will need to get over, and you might extend this to all progressive parties, is that coalitions will be necessary to sustain this. And also coalitions require compromise. And it's quite interesting that we're talking about elections in Britain, in France, and the United States, where compromise in politics is basically a dirty word. In Europe, by contrast, we say that the European Union is built on compromise. But I think it's fair to say that right now, French politicians are struggling to compromise to find a viable government that keeps out both extremes. In the United States, you're hopeless at compromise. Look at the way that Congress never gets anything done and so on. And in Britain, we hate the word and prefer what we call one-party rule. But we've got to get over that if we're going to defeat the right, and particularly the hard right, in the long term. So I would say go for some kind of electoral reform, a proportional system, and I'm agnostic as to which system. But we've got to accept that coalitions are going to be part of that, and coalitions depend on compromise.
Thank you very much. Evan, Syriza has been historically in favor of a simple proportional system. In the current electoral arithmetic of Greece and the EU, can viable governments be formed using simple proportional? You can unmute. Evan?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. So I would like to agree with what Michael said and say that it's not, to give the Greek example, as you say, Syriza historically has supported a more proportional system. And in fact, in the process of constitutional change and the discussion on constitutional change that took place a few years ago when Syriza was in government in 2016, the proposal that it had tabled was exactly to have a much more proportional system. And unfortunately, at that time, this was not supported by PASOK at the time, which it could only benefit from such a change. Because if that change had taken place, then it would have been very difficult to have this kind of imbalance in the Greek political system that we see today. It would be much more possible to have coalition governments, and there would be a much stronger culture of a political culture of compromise and coalition building. Of course, it couldn't happen overnight. It would take some time, but at least the creation of multi-party governments in Greece, in a country where we all know that institutional checks and balances are weaker than many other Western European in particular countries, in terms of the judiciary, in terms of independent authorities, in terms of not having a strong legislature, in terms of the media, parties that multi-party governments would be a check, an extra check on ensuring that the rule of law is implemented, and on strengthening democracy in Greece. And as Michael said, it would be a check on the prospect, which doesn't exist directly today, but it could very easily exist in the very near future, given the results in Greece, of a stronger far right in Greece, and a situation where the right and far right had a very different balance than the one we see today, and not necessarily in terms of building a coalition, but in terms of taking over the politics and the rhetoric of the right, which is something that we see in many countries, including, first of all, in the United States, but also, as Michael said, in the UK. So I think, and I support this very much, that more proportional systems, contrary to what is a lot of times discussed, are an extra check in ensuring that we don't have a strong conservative and far-right coalitions or strong conservative parties with far-right ideas that govern for 14 years or for a long period of time. I think that would be a positive development, and it's a great pity it didn't happen in Greece a few years ago.
Thank you, Evan. Sarah Jane, it looks like you have a very good question to ask. You wanted to ask it live?
Sure. First, can I thank Michael and Evan for your very lucid descriptions. It's really been a pleasure listening to you. So I wrote, the European Parliament chart clearly shows the increase in polarization over the years. We have a similar situation in the US. So what policy prescriptions, aside from this sort of proportional electoral system, which might take a long time and a lot of consensus to put into effect in the US, what would you suggest to turn this trend around, to get back to the idea of a collective good? Is there a magic bullet?
I like to say that the Labour government in Britain heralds the dawn of the most stable, sensible, boring kind of government you could ever imagine, probably for a period of about 10 years. I mean, it is quite remarkable that just a few years after Brexit, Britain now has the most sensible, you can call it progressive if you want, and we can see exactly how progressive it is, but it is really the most sensible, stable government with an assured majority, probably for a period of about 10 years, anywhere in the Western world, which is pretty remarkable. And I can tell you it hasn't got there by having exciting policies. No excitement on climate, for example, nothing on rights. No, this is about competence. The Conservative government were booted out because they were hopeless. We wanted some grown-ups running the country. And we now feel that in Britain, at least, we have some grown-ups running the country. Phew, thank goodness. And we, famously non-political Brits, can kind of go back to sleep now because we've got sensible people in charge. So what I would say is don't ignore the importance of pure competence. And it does seem to be the case, and I'm sure I'm biased, and we're probably all biased in this room, that just by having competent leaders, you would do appeal to quite a large electorate. Tony Blair used to say that British elections are fought and won in the center. And that is why he tried to bring his party, New Labour, to the center ground, pinching policies, ideas, votes from the Conservative Party. And I think people recognize once again that he was right and is right in that. British politics are won in the center. I suspect that given a choice, American politics are much the same. I may be wrong, you can dispute it. I would say too that European politics by and large are one in the center. If you look at the current composition of the European Parliament, yes, the rise of extremists at both ends, but the essential pro-European coalition in the center is still there. And don't expect any excitement. It's mainly going to be competence. It's going to be firefighting. How do we deal with Ukraine? How do we deal with China? How do we, yes, make the most of AI? And the climate crisis is coming faster and faster towards us. How are we going to manage all these separate crises? Underpinned by common values, yes. The rule of law in particular. I think that's where you will win elections. With one slight nuance, and here I want to pick up on a very important point that Evan made, identity politics. I do think it's important that progressive parties put up candidates that have a particular appeal to certain groups. And Kamala, I mean, the way that Kamala Harris has reignited the US elections, I think is a good illustration of this. The female vote, the black vote, whatever it is, I think that's important and that seems to be making a difference. And I think in Britain, for example, we've had two female prime ministers. We've had a prime minister now of Asian descent. We have a foreign secretary in David Lammy, who introduced himself as a descendant of enslaved people, a black working class man from Tottenham in North London, a community which has never produced a foreign secretary. I mean, that does actually have an appeal to large parts of the British electorate. To put another way, and I will shut up, but to put it another way, Labour lost votes in the Muslim community in Britain because of its stance on Israel and Palestine. Its failure to stand up for Palestinians in Gaza and on the West Bank in particular lost it votes, including in Keir Starmer's constituency. A Labour frontbencher lost his seat very unexpectedly because of the Muslim vote that were fed up that Labour was towing, I'm going to call it a pro-Israeli line, rather too slavishly. And it's interesting that Labour, after 3 weeks in power, has threatened to withdraw export licenses for arms sales to Israel, has supported the ICC in its indictment of, well, it hasn't reached that point, but its wish to put Netanyahu up on charges of causing genocide, and is talking about recognizing Palestine as a state. So things are moving on that front. So appealing to particular groups is important to an important part of progressive politics, I think.
Thank you, Michael. And Evan, if you could, in your answer, could you touch on Gaza as well? Because it's a very important issue for American progressives, a very divisive issue, one that made key constituencies look at each other with deep suspicion. And I'm curious if the European Union has found a magic formula to bridge those gaps and maybe take the lead, since the United States cannot do it on this issue.
Yes, well, if I may, I'd like to reply to this question because I think it's a very interesting one, but on the basis of Chatham House rules and not publicize my answer, because I would like to say something about my personal experience about this. So, is that all right?
Okay, let it be understood that what Evan says is not something that can be attributed to him anywhere outside this conversation. And
is it possible to turn off the recording for just that moment?
I mean, I can do that.
So my question is, where you've seen it happening in Europe or elsewhere, where the right wing has been borrowing our rhetoric, how much do they actually come through with in terms of real policy? And does anybody notice that if we don't call them on it?
I'm not really sure I recognize this notion of the right wing stealing progressive politics. I'm afraid I see it more the other way. We mentioned Gaza, where the Labour Party has taken a line which has been following the Conservative Party, the right in our politics, on Israel. The Labour Party has done that partly because it suffered a huge internal difficulty over claims of anti-Semitism within its ranks, but that's quite a long issue, which I don't think we should go into here. I don't think there has been much borrowing, except, I mean, look at the issue of migration, which is very high salience in all our elections. There has been a kind of convergence. The Labour Party has, so to speak, borrowed the Conservative line on migration. Tony Blair, I remember watching Tony Blair in government saying, we must stop migration. And he was prepared to do anything to persuade the judges in our country to stem the flow of migrants, legal or not. And this was, to me, slightly shocking. And ever since then, the Labour Party has tried to show itself to be extremely tough on migration. And that's been, well, personally, a personal disappointment for me. A failure to recognize that Britain has been built on migration, just as I think the United States and France have too. So it's almost the other way. I don't see the Labour Party borrowing policies from the right. Or sorry, I don't see the extremists borrowing Labour Party policies, but perhaps I'm not looking in the right place.
Well, there has been an attempt by the Republicans to co-opt parts of the labor movement, or at least neutralize them as a Democratic Party bastion. But that's happens everywhere, I think. So Evan, your response.
Yes, I think, Michael, you have a point. There's an article that I'll send around. I have to find it in The Guardian that says, and this is maybe where you're coming from, that the Tories and the far right in the UK are the only are the only right and far right that do not borrow any of the statist economic arguments from the left, unlike the continental far right parties. And the example of Orban is the most, popular one, the most clear one. Even some of what Meloni does, but not in general, where they, but definitely Le Pen does this, where they try to take some of the arguments that have to do with the welfare state and protecting workers and use it in their rhetoric. And there is a third chart that I've sent to Brady that refers to the French elections, and it shows that the biggest percentage of support to Le Pen comes from the disadvantaged part of the society or from the working class. Now, obviously, this is because of identity politics, all right, as you said, but it's not only because of identity politics. Le Pen openly says that that the farmers and people living in rural areas who are disadvantaged, or at least not as advantaged as others, should not be paying for the green agenda and for the transition to a new policy on fighting climate change. And there's all those arguments in terms of protecting, the markets, protecting, the national industries that different far right and right parties use. I mean, we've seen this happen traditionally, even in the 30s with fascism. I'm not saying it's a new phenomenon, but I believe that spectral politics and the idea that some parties will opportunistically pick and choose from different agendas, from the extreme left to the extreme right, is a real, is a growing trend. And I think the way to fight it, and the way to fight what was said in the Republican Party, where they try to take over some of the social agenda or some of the peace agenda, I'd also add, where Vance comes out and says, if you don't want your son to fight for another globalist war that the Democrats have pushed, then vote for us. I think the way to fight for that is to have I think the word sensible is a good one, sensible policies, but sometimes sensible policies have to be also policies that are innovative and that make change and that make a difference. Sometimes sensible is something we haven't thought about, and it has to be a new foreign policy that aims at, both international law, protecting international law and peace, or a new migration policy that does not is not for it does not support pushbacks or sending people to Rwanda, but supports orderly migration with specific agreements. So I think there's a whole agenda there that people from everywhere, from the center to the left, could accept, that we're not getting across enough. And if we can get it across in a reliable way with reliable speakers and reliable, politicians, then we can stop the right and the Republican Party trying to take chunks of progressive politics and use them in a populist way, the way they're trying to do.
Evan, thank you very much. That actually seems like you've summarized very nicely what our mission as Democrats has to be. I was going to give each of you sort of one more minute for a peroration, to a final sort of tragic or optimistic message. In the good old days, foreign leaders would try to intervene in U.S. elections, like Putin trying to help Donald Trump get elected. Unfortunately, the European Union doesn't seem to do that very well. So, Michael, since I think we Democrats are on our own to win the election, what can you tell us?
Well, about 10 days ago, I was in the office of someone who works in the decision-making corridors of Brussels, who was about to go on holiday. This was the day after that Ursula von der Leyen had been reconfirmed as president of the European Commission for the next 5 years. It was the day after the Blenheim Palace meeting of the European political community. And she was packing up to go on holiday for 4 weeks. And I was asking her how she felt and whether she felt ready for a holiday. And she said, well, looking around, we can see that as of now, the Brits are back. The French have chosen a speaker of the Assemblée Nationale who is left, but not, well, a centrist left, but not from the extremes. The European Parliament has re-elected the president of the Commission that we wanted. And by Sunday, the Democrats will have persuaded Biden to step down to be replaced by Kamala Harris. So in a sense, my work is done, she says, and I can go on holiday for 4 weeks and relax over that time. And, she may have been right. Europe does stumble from crisis to crisis. It's the way it works. It's the way it progresses. And there is no streamlined third way going in a smooth arc to a better place. Europe works through crisis, and I'm sure the United States is the same. I am actually feeling a little more optimistic now than I did a few months ago when I was in Macon. I think that things could be a lot worse than they are. It's really important that we don't allow Russia to win in Ukraine. And there are subcategories of that. I would warn you all to watch elections in Georgia, I think on the 24th or 28th of October. Also elections in Moldova and a referendum on EU membership in Moldova a week or so earlier in October. If those go the wrong way, and they might well do so, this will be devastating to the European Union, its geopolitical ambitions, and I think cause huge waves of uncertainty around the continent. But there are poles of stability. I think the French will find a way through their current crisis. The German government needs to hold on, and they'll probably manage to do that more or less. As I say, Britain is looking more stable and sensible than anyone could have expected. And I'm more hopeful than I was that you in the United States will choose the sensible path. So I'm going away on holiday feeling moderately, cautiously optimistic.
Well, that's very reassuring. Thank you, Michael. Last thoughts, Evan?
I agree with Michael. I think I'm feeling more optimistic too with a lot of what was just said. I would just like to add, I believe sensibility in a world that is shaking and changing as it is needs some brave, exciting if you want, but brave decisions. Here in Greece, Alexis Tsipras highlighted that the other day at the event he organized, which was the first event of the Alexis Tsipras Institute for Peace and Justice and Sustainable Growth. And he said, look, we don't have the luxury to kick the can down the road in any field, whether it's diplomacy and geopolitical developments, the economy, social issues, or climate change. And we need to be sensible, but that means being brave and taking decisions that have a political cost sometimes. And I think that means learning from our mistakes, and we have made many as progressives, but also in the West in general, and being assertive about things that we have to do in terms of protecting citizens' lives, protecting society, supporting the right candidates, but who are also ones who have learned that we should not give in to the far right in these times, and even if that means that we have to rethink some of our policies, we have to rethink some of our rhetoric. And I think a sensible politics is one that needs some rethinking on many levels. And I believe strongly that this is what we need to do. Luckily, we have more time now because of the British elections, because of the French elections, hopefully with the American election. But let's not fool ourselves that we found a silver bullet.
Thank you very much, Evan. What I'd just like to say in closing is that if governments listened more carefully to their diplomats, the world would often be a better place. Can we all give a round of applause to our two speakers and thank them from the bottom of our hearts for sharing things with us this evening?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.